Today we'll be discussing the fifth and final part of Spinoza's Ethics in this translation, which represents the culmination of the whole book. We've seen in the previous four parts how Spinoza wants to free humanity from the bondage to the passions. In part 4, he presented the perfectionistic ideal, the ethical ideal of the model or exemplary human, the free man. This was a man who acts solely from adequate ideas, which in Spinoza's metaphysical system implies that he acts solely from his own essence, or his conatus, his internal striving to persevere in existence, and acts solely out of his own power. Such a man pursues the maximal activity and power of which he is capable, and thereby perfects himself. Since perfection is the same thing as reality for Spinoza, this means that the free man strives for the greatest degree of reality. The free man experiences joy in existence through an increase of his power and activity. He's motivated solely by the dictates of reason, which direct him to seek his own advantage and to pursue what is useful. But living in accordance with reason, he lives a life that is most joyful and worth pursuing for its own sake. It's most joyful because, unlike the passionate life, it does not vacillate between joy and sadness, but rather consists in a constant joy. The highest goal of the free man is knowledge, which is what is most useful to him, and indeed is valued for its own sake, since it gives him the highest degree of reality of which he is capable. Spinoza explains that the aim of part 5 is to show, quote, the means or the way leading to freedom, unquote. In other words, he will show you here how to apply the model of the free man developed in part 4 to your own life. This part deals not only with the way to become a free man, but with the ultimate ends of human life, which Spinoza characterizes as the state of blessedness, and eternity, which is a kind of immortality. In the preface to part 5, he says that he will discuss, quote, the power of the mind or of reason, and shall show, above all, how great its dominion over the affects is, and what kind of dominion it has for restraining and moderating them. Now, restraining and moderating the passions is not easy, and as we saw in part 4, it can never be accomplished completely. Spinoza observes, this is on page 160, that much practice and application are required to restrain and moderate them. Nevertheless, it is a key tenet of Spinoza's system that the mind does have the power to have a great effect on the passions and to bring them under the dominion of reason. Knowledge alone can be a remedy for the affects. It can lessen the sadness that results from the deleterious external causes. But the question is, how can it do this? Well, Spinoza will argue that there are two ways in which increasing knowledge can combat the inordinate power of the affects. First, it can reduce their proportion of the mind by replacing passions with clear and distinct ideas. Excuse me. Second, it can replace the unstable objects of love that come from external causes with God itself as an object of love. So those are the two ways in which increasing knowledge can combat the passions and their inordinate power upon the mind by reducing their proportion in the mind and replacing passions with clear and distinct ideas. So a kind of reform of the mind, supplementing the passions that currently exist with clear and distinct ideas, really transforming passions into clear and distinct ideas. And second, it can replace the unstable objects of love that typically motivate us to desire things and to to perform certain actions in life with more stable objects, and in particular, God itself. So in Proposition 1, Part 5, Spinoza reminds us of his doctrine of the parallelism of the modes of thought and extension. He writes as follows. Proposition 1. In just the same way as thoughts and ideas of things are ordered and connected in the mind, so the affections of the body or images of things are ordered and connected in the body. Demonstration. The order and connection of ideas is the same as the order and connection of things, and vice versa, the order and connection of things is the same as the order and connection of ideas. Just as the order and connection of ideas happens in the mind, according to the order and connection of affections of the body, so vice versa, the order and connections of affections of the body happens as thoughts and ideas are ordered and connected in the mind. So, we might wonder why Spinoza is bringing up this old point here. And the answer is because he wants to reestablish the metaphysical foundation for the power of the understanding to change the affects. Recall that the passions arise because external bodies affect our human bodies. However, no external body can literally cause any idea for Spinoza. Rather, what happens is that an external body causes a change in my body, and a corresponding idea of my body in my mind causes a new idea to arise in my mind, corresponding to the change in my body. However, notice that the reverse is also possible, and that's what Spinoza wants to draw our attention to here. By changing or causing a change in the ordering of my ideas in my mind, reordering the ideas of my mind, which my mind, insofar as it is a mode of God, has the power to do, by doing that I can change the modes of my body as well. The ideas of my mind can change other ideas of my mind, and in doing that, there will be a corresponding change, necessarily, based upon this parallelism doctrine, in the modes of my body, including lessening, blocking, or removing the effects of external bodies on it, which Spinoza describes as the passions. So this is sort of Spinoza's version of mind over matter. However, in his metaphysical system, mind doesn't really have a causal power over matter, nor matter on mind, but rather a change in the ordering of my ideas necessarily, as a result of metaphysical necessity, will have a change in the constitution of my body. And in this way, I can gain some measure of control over the passions. The mechanism of this control is spelled out over the next several propositions. First, in Proposition 2, he writes, if we separate passions or affects from the thought of an external cause and join them to other thoughts, then love or hate towards the external cause is destroyed, as are the vacillations of mind arising from these affects. Demonstration. For what constitutes the form of love or hate is joy or sadness, accompanied by the idea of an external cause. So if this is taken away, the form of love or hate is taken away at the same time. Hence, these affects and those arising from them are destroyed. So there's, a transformation. Clearly, you see the language here of transformation of ideas. But it takes place through this rather mysterious process, as it's described here, at least mysterious, of separating the emotions or the affects from an external cause and joining them to other thoughts. But this is rather obscure. What does he have in mind here? We might well wonder what this separation is and how it can be possible at all. How can separation of an idea from its cause be possible at all, since thoughts are modes that stand in causal connection with other modes. So in what sense is separation possible in this situation? And also, in what sense can we join our separated thoughts, assuming it's possible to separate them from their causes? How can we join our separated thoughts to other thoughts? Well, Propositions 3 and 4 clarify what the point of this process will be, at least. It will be to arrive at a clear and distinct idea of the passions. So Proposition 3 says, an affect which is a passion ceases to be a passion as soon as we form a clear and distinct idea of it. And Proposition 4 says, there is no affection of the body of which we cannot form a clear and distinct concept. Since a passion is by its very nature a confused idea, if we form a distinct idea of it, it ceases to be a passion. Right? The passion is by its very nature a confused idea. So if we clarify, we've removed the form of confusion, so to speak, from the idea, and therefore, by definition, it no longer is a passion. Moreover, since there is in God an adequate idea corresponding to every confused idea, it will, in principle at least, be possible to form a clear and distinct idea of every passion. In the Scholium to Proposition 4, Spinoza writes as follows. He says, this is the second paragraph there in the Scholium, page 164. We must therefore take special care to know each affect clearly and distinctly as far as this is possible, so that in this way the mind may be determined from an affect to thinking those things which it perceives clearly and distinctly, and with which it is fully satisfied, and so that the affect itself may be separated from the thought of an external cause and joined to true thoughts. So that's what it's joined to, true thoughts. The result will be not only that love, hate, and the like are destroyed, but also that the appetites or desires which usually arise from such an affect cannot be excessive. Here Spinoza clearly states that the separation of the passion from its external cause will come about through knowing the affect clearly and distinctly and joining it to true thoughts, what he calls true thoughts. So what are these true thoughts? That's obviously a pressing question here. And in what does the clarification and making distinct of the passions consist? Spinoza's answer is, it consists in expanding our understanding of the causes that lead to a given idea. So we're not removing the idea from the chain of causes in any way, but rather we're expanding our perspective as we're stepping back so that we have a wider perspective of the causes. That will give us a truer picture of just how many causes are determining this external effect that's causing a passion. And once we come to an understanding of how many causes have contributed to determining this effect, we're going to dispel the illusion that the passion is due to one given external cause alone. And this in turn will cause the passion itself to be dispelled as we come to have a clear and distinct idea of it. So in a bit I'll give a concrete example of this, but passions, we know the myriad forms of hatred, for example, they're directed typically towards singular external objects, right? I hate that man. I hate this being in this family. I hate this job, right? They're directed towards specific external objects. But this hatred Spinoza is observing here depends upon my isolation of this particular thing from all of the causes that fed into it and treating it as if it were a standalone free cause. This is the point he makes in Proposition 5, the bottom of 164, where he says, the greatest affect of all, other things equal, is one toward the thing we imagine simply, and neither as necessary, nor as possible, nor as contingent. Demonstration. An affect toward a thing we imagine to be free is greater than that towards a thing we imagine to be necessary, and consequently is still greater than that toward a thing we imagine as possible or contingent. But imagining a thing as free can be nothing but simply imagining it while we are ignorant of the causes by which it has been determined to act. To imagine a thing as free is to imagine it while being ignorant of the causes by which it was determined. In other words, the whole idea of this cause being a free cause is an illusion. It's not true. Therefore, an affect toward a thing we imagine simply is, other things equal, greater than that towards a thing we imagine as necessary, possible, or contingent. Now, this proposition here depends crucially on Proposition 49 from the third part. So it might be useful to go back and review this. This is on page 95. We're talking about Propositions 49 and 48, actually. So Proposition 49 says, Given an equal cause of love, love towards a thing will be greater if we imagine the thing to be free than if we imagine it to be necessary. And similarly for hate. Again, this is Proposition 49 on page 95 in the third part. Demonstration. A thing we imagine to be free must be perceived through itself without others. So if we imagine it to be the cause of joy or sadness, we shall thereby love or hate it, and shall do this with the greatest love or hate that can arise from a given affect. But if we should imagine as necessary the thing which is the cause of this affect, then we shall imagine it to be the cause of the affect not alone but with others, and so our love or hate for it will be less. Scholium. From this it follows that because men consider themselves to be free, they have a greater love or hate towards one another than towards other things. Our very belief in our freedom is the cause of our greater hatred for one another. So this proposition, notice here, he references Proposition 48, our love or hate towards it is less or greater. Proposition 48 says, love or hate, say of Peter, is destroyed if the sadness the hate involves or the joy the love involves is attached to the idea of another cause, and each is diminished to the extent that we imagine that Peter was not its only cause. Demonstration. This is evident simply from the definitions of love and hate. For this joy is called love of Peter, or the sadness, hatred of Peter, only because Peter is considered to be the cause of the one affect or the other. If this is taken away, either wholly or in part, the affect towards Peter is also diminished, either wholly or in part. So the idea here is quite simple, actually. So suppose I hate you with a certain degree of intensity, say 10 units of hate. You know, maybe we could measure this by how much my blood pressure is increased when I imagine your presence or something like that, right? But I would just make up this unit of hate, 10 units of hate. So this is because I've connected the idea of you as a cause with a certain sadness I'm experiencing. That's why I have 10 units of hatred for you, because of the degree of sadness I'm experiencing with the idea that you are the cause of the sadness. If I see you as the sole cause of my sadness, then all 10 units of my hatred will be directed at you. However, if I see you in a different light, if I come to the realization or the perception that you're being half caused to act in the way that caused my sadness by some other thing, in that case, I won't blame you 100% anymore. Rather, I'll split my hatred between you and the other thing, depending upon my sense of the proportion of how much responsibility each of you have. So, for example, if I think some other person gave you some false information about me, and as a result, you punch me in the nose, right? Before I realized that the other person was giving you this false information about me, I hated you with all 10 units of my hatred, right? But I come to realize, oh, someone told you some false information. Well, now, I hate you less, clearly. And I place some of my hatred that formerly was placed on you onto this other person. Maybe I still think you should have confirmed it before punching me in the nose. So I still hate you, 5 units, right? But now I also have 5 units of hatred for this other person. So the hatred I previously had that was all directed towards this one external cause, namely you, is now dispersed between these two causes. That's the basic principle here that Spinoza is operating with. Now, likewise, if you expand this, if I see that you were caused to hit me by like 9 other things, I'll divide my hatred between them. Right? So if there was some conspiracy against me by these other people feeding false information, or if there was something that I, even of course blame could be placed on myself for something I had done partially. So now I blame you and 9 other things. So now only 1 unit of hatred is placed on you, right? And you see the principle here. In this way, my hatred of you is dissipated through being dispersed through all these antecedent causes. And now I don't even hate you that much anymore because it's, the hatred is dispersed through all these other causes. Now, of course, we know that for Spinoza, if we had a perfectly adequate idea of the cause, we would see that the causes are actually infinite. So if I had a perfectly adequate idea of what actually caused you to punch me, I would come to see that the cause of your punching me can actually be dispersed to an infinite number of things. right? If I went back and I said, okay, so you punched me, in part because of your rash temper and in part because someone gave you false information. Well, your rash temper and your false information, the false information the person gave you, didn't cause themselves. They were caused by antecedent causes as well, right? So I can continue going back, tracing, like, what were the causes that caused that person to give you false information about me? What was the cause of your rash temper, right? Maybe you had a difficult childhood or something like that. And if I had the time and I had God's infinite intellect and I could investigate all these causes, my hatred for you would be dispersed among an infinity of different causes that led to your action. And we can see here then that the 10 units of hatred that I direct at you would more or less vanish. It would evaporate because it would have to be dispersed among all these different things. The external cause of my hatred would no longer be seen as one thing at all, but an infinite number of things. And that's what it means for Spinoza to arrive at a clear and distinct idea of any passion, to realize that the external cause of your sadness is not any one thing. And we can now see how arriving at a clear and distinct idea, which means arriving at a complete perspective of all the causes that contributed to the effect, would dissipate the effect and dissipate the affect with an A. It would dissipate the affect completely, as I would have to divide it among an infinite number of things. So the clearer and more distinct, i.e. the more adequate, in Spinoza's sense of adequacy, that my ideas are of things, the weaker the hold that my affects will have on me. And this is the point that he makes in Proposition 6, going back to part 5 rather. He says, page 165, insofar as the mind understands all things as necessary, it has a greater power over the affects, and is less acted upon by them. Demonstration. The mind understands all things to be necessary and to be determined by an infinite connection of causes to exist and produce effects. And so, to that extent, the mind brings it about that it is less acted upon by the affects springing from these things and is less affected towards them. In the scholium that follows here, he relates this abstract metaphysical point to our common experience, where he says this: the more this knowledge that things are necessary is concerned with singular things, which we imagine more distinctly and vividly, the greater is this power of the mind over the affects, as experience also testifies. For we see that sadness over some good which has perished is lessened as soon as the man who has lost it realizes that this good could not in any way have been kept. Similarly, we see that no one pities infants because of their inability to speak, to walk, or to reason, or because they live so many years, as it were, unconscious of themselves. But if most people were born grown up, and only one or two were born infants, then everyone would pity the infants, because they would regard infancy itself not as a natural and necessary thing, but as a vice of nature or a sin. We could point out many things along this line, right? So that's a great example. Like, no one says, "Oh, look at that poor baby. It's so helpless. It can't speak. It can't really control its limbs. This is such a horrible thing," because everyone just assumes that this is just a necessary part of human life. You see it that way, and so you don't think this is bad. But if it came to be that people could be born like Athena, sprung full grown from the brow of Zeus or whatever in the myth, then infants would be viewed as being subject to this horrible misfortune, right? So necessity changes our perception of things. And so now we see what the separation and the joining that Spinoza referred to in Proposition 2, right? If we separate the emotions or affects from the thought of an external cause and join them to other thoughts. What this separating or joining referred to in Proposition 2 means is this. It takes place in the following way. We separate our idea from a single external cause, which we do not by making it uncaused, but rather by expanding our perspective of the causes to which it's subject. But that is to say, we separate it by joining it to many other causes that led up to the one that initially we attributed our affect to all by itself. So instead of confusedly linking my affect to just one single object, I link it or join it to a whole entire array of objects. in a branching causal network. And so the separation is really just a matter of a kind of dispersion of my attention. Right? I disperse my dispersal of my attention. I disperse it among all these other different causes. That's where the separation comes in. By joining the idea of this one single thing, right? You punching me in the nose or whatever, my attention was all focused on that. So I separate my attention, my idea from that by joining it to all these other causes. That's the idea. And this is the point, essentially, it's made explicitly in Proposition 9. If an affect related to more and different causes if an affect is related to more and different causes which the mind considers together with the affect itself, it is less harmful. We are less acted upon by it, and we are affected less towards each cause than is the case with another equally great affect which is related to only one cause or to fewer causes. Demonstration. An affect is only evil or harmful insofar as it prevents the mind from being able to think. And so that affect which determines the mind to consider many objects together is less harmful than another equally great affect which engages the mind solely in considering one or a few objects so that it cannot think of others. This is the first point. So, Spinoza is observing something psychologically very evident, which is if you punch me in the nose and you're standing there in front of me, gloating after punching me in the nose, it's very difficult for me to think of the fact that you were caused by an infinity of different causes to do that. Right? My mind, as it were, due to its finite limitations, is just focused on you, and I'm just burning up with my 10 units of hatred directed just at you. So it is possible for an affect to make it impossible for me to think. Of course, this depends upon my character and how much of a cool and rational character I have, and that's something that we can work on and develop. Anger management. And then I'll just round out this demonstration here. Next, because the mind's essence, that is power, consists only in thought, the mind is less acted upon by an affect which determines it to consider many things together than by an equally great affect which keeps the mind engaged solely in considering one or few objects. This is the second point. And finally, insofar as this affect is related to many external causes, it also less towards each one. And the question here arises, as this last example just suggested, whether we really have the power to attain to such an understanding or such a broadened perspective. Isn't it the case that sometimes we're so much in the power of a passion that the mind cannot free itself in order to contemplate things in this broader way? In Proposition 10, and already here in this Proposition 2, as I alluded to, Spinoza acknowledges that sometimes we are in fact torn by affects that prevent the mind from understanding. And for this reason, we should not expect our understanding to ever be completely in control of the affects. As modes of nature, we're subject to external causes impinging upon the body in a way that's beyond our control, or at least our complete control. However, by the same token, this is no excuse for failing to try to free our mind from the affects to the degree that's available to us. And just as we'll always be bound to the passions to some degree, we will also always be capable of freeing ourselves from the dominion of the passions to some degree. And at least this seems to be the upshot of Proposition 10, where he says, so long as we are not torn by affects contrary to our nature, we have the power of ordering and connecting the affections of the body according to the order of the intellect. Affects which are contrary to our nature, that is, which are evil insofar as they prevent the mind from understanding. Therefore, so long as we are not torn by affects contrary to our nature, the power of the mind by which it strives to understand things is not hindered. Right? So, of course, by being subject to extreme conditions, extreme hunger or sleep deprivation or torture or whatever. These are things contrary to our nature, Spinoza is saying here. And our nature is to understand. And they can destroy our ability to understand. Brainwashing, hypnosis, there could be a whole bunch of different things in this category. But he says, so long as we're not subject to those things, then our ability to understand is not hindered. So long then the mind has the power of forming clear and distinct ideas and of deducing some from others. And hence so long do we have the power of ordering and connecting the affections of the body according to the order of the intellect? Spinoza follows this up with some practical advice on how to maximize our power over the affects. So pay attention. Here's where you get your money's worth from struggling through the ethics. Some practical advice. In the scholium here, this is the second sentence. He says, a greater force is required for restraining affects ordered and connected according to the intellect than for restraining those which are uncertain and random. The best thing then we can do, so long as we do not have perfect knowledge of our affects, is to conceive a correct principle of living. To conceive a correct principle of living, or sure maxims of life. Rules for living. And to commit them to memory. So come up with some good principles of life or maxims, commit them to memory, and apply them constantly to the particular cases frequently encountered in life. In this way, our imagination will be extensively affected by them, and we shall always have them ready. For example, we have laid it down as a maxim of life that hate is to be conquered by love or nobility, not by repaying it with hate in return. But in order that we may always have this rule of reason ready when it is needed, we ought to think about and meditate frequently on the common wrongs of men and how they may be warded off best by nobility, right? What are some things that in the course of the next month, let's say, if you're out and about, you're sure to encounter, right? So, someone being rude, right? Someone driving on the road, not paying attention, looking at their cell phone or something, endangering others. So he says we should think about and imagine these common situations so that we're prepared for them and we expect them. If you've gone a whole month without someone being rude to you, pat yourself on the back and consider yourself fortunate because you had every right to expect that to happen. You should be expecting it. You should be expecting this. You should be expecting that, if you are getting like 10 packages a month from UPS, that one of them is going to be delivered to the wrong address or going to get porch pirated or something like that, right? So prepare yourself and expect those situations. If we join the image of a wrong to the imagination of this maxim, it will always be ready for us when a wrong is done to us. If we have ready also the principle of our own true advantage, and also of the good which follows from mutual friendship and common society, and keep in mind, moreover, the highest satisfaction of mind stems from the right principle of living, and that men, like other things, act from the necessity of nature, then the wrong or the hate that usually arises from it will occupy a very small part of the imagination and will easily be overcome, right? So keep in mind the principle of your own true advantage, like what do I really want to get out of, let's say, this package being delivered to me? How important is this really in the grand scheme of things? And so let's say I'm ordering something like, a new pair of slippers or something like that. It's not really that important. I can order a replacement. It's not really worth it stressing myself out and taking years off my life, right? Over a pair of slippers. That's the kind of thing he's imagining. Also, it's, you don't want to overreact. Keep in mind that, it's a good thing that we have, UPS and parcel delivery services and so on. You're not going to want to burn your bridges and, curse off the UPS guy or whatever so they refuse to deliver to you anymore, right? Keep things in perspective. And keep in mind that, the highest satisfaction of mind comes from the right principle of living. In other words, the highest satisfaction comes in how you comport yourself, whether you're a good person, not whether your feet are cold. Right, so you can put up with having cold feet in the literal sense here, if that means you're preserving your own integrity and your own, virtue of being a kind and reasonable person or whatever. And if you also keep in mind, of course, that what happened by the necessity of nature, and that's going to be a recurrent theme. Right? So here's how he's recommending you should control your passions. You need to practice training of the mind to be constantly prepared to always remind yourself of the big picture and to be resistant to being captured by particular objects and situations that have an adverse effect on you. Okay, so this leads us to the first discussion question. Do you think Spinoza gives effective practical advice on how to free ourselves from the bondage to the passions? Why or why not? Do you think Spinoza gives effective practical advice on how to free ourselves from the bondage to the passions. Why or why not? That's the first discussion question. So in everyday life, of course, we don't have the time and leisure to be constantly investigating and keeping in our mind the chain of causes with everything that affects us. And instead, the way to keep reason in the driver's seat, so to speak, is to train the imagination. And so that's what he's describing in a series of propositions here, Proposition 11, 12, and 13. He says, page 168, Proposition 11, an image is related to more things the more frequent it is, or the more often it flourishes, and the more it engages the mind. Proposition 12, the images of things are more easily joined to images related to things you understand clearly and distinctly than to other images. Proposition 13, the more an image is joined with other images, the more often it flourishes. We could talk more about this, but basically the overall idea here is probably pretty intuitive. In the case of, imagining future situations that you're going to encounter, they're going to challenge your ability to keep control of your passions. You should train your imagination so that you're prepared for these situations. We train the imagination, in particular, for Spinoza, in a centrally important way. We train the imagination for him to link the body's affections with the idea of God. I should say, instead of we, I should say that the free man would train the body's affections, the imagination rather, to link the body's affections to the idea of God. Proposition 14, the mind can bring it about that all the body's affections or images of things are related to the idea of God. Demonstration, there is no affection of the body of which the mind cannot form some clear and distinct concept, and so it can bring it about that they are related to the idea of God. The goal is to live one's life always in keeping with the broadest possible perspective of reality, which is the perspective contained in the idea of God. And you notice he's referring to the imagination here. I can't always have, as it were, a solid intellectual grasp. And of course, my intelligence is too limited to have a complete grasp. But even to have a partial grasp of the infinite linking of causes in the mind of God is beyond, the average person's everyday consciousness. So the goal is to keep in mind a kind of general image of everything being in God. Always keeping in mind the broadest possible perspective of reality, that everything is one in God. This perspective of reality is not a bloodless, rational perspective alone. It contains for Spinoza its own affective component, the intellectual love of God. And so this is an important aspect here. Spinoza can sometimes give the impression that he's recommending a complete elimination or abolition of the passions, of all love and hate, so that we become, some kind of ideal Vulcan from the Star Trek series or something like that. But that's not what he's saying. That rather, what it turns out that his real problem with the passions are, first of all, that the passions that relate to sadness and lead to hatred are bad for us. They cause a diminishment of our power and our activity, and they're bad for us. They make us less perfect. And so we do want to eliminate all hatred and sadness from ourselves as much as possible. But of course, love represents an increase in our ability. We don't want to eliminate love. The problem with love that is a passion that's due to external objects is that these objects have only a very uncertain and wavering, unsteady and unstable relationship to ourselves, right? And so, what we once loved can easily become an object of hate. And of course, if we become dependent on things we love, removing them causes sadness and so on. So for Spinoza, the ideal is to replace those sorts of affects, which are positive affects, love, caused by external objects, the love that is a passion, to replace that with this intellectual love of God. When I contemplate God, what I'm doing is increasing my understanding and perfection. And you'll recall that love for Spinoza is simply the connecting of an idea with an increase in one's perfection. So when I'm contemplating God, I am increasing my understanding and perfection. And if I connect that increase of my perfection that grows with greater understanding with the idea of God as its cause, the result is an affect, namely this intellectual love of God. So therefore, when I connect the idea of God to the increase in perfection that comes about when I contemplate him, I ipso facto love God for Spinoza. Let's look at Proposition 15, top of 169. He who understands himself and his affects clearly and distinctly loves God, and does so the more he understands himself and his affects. Demonstration. He who understands himself and his affects clearly and distinctly rejoices, and this joy is accompanied by the idea of God. Hence he loves God, and so it does so the more he understands himself and his affects. This love, as we might expect from our knowledge of part 1, does have a kind of impersonal character. It does not aim at evoking God's love in return or in avoiding God's hate. For Spinoza's God is beyond loving and hating. Later we'll qualify this a bit, but in Proposition 17, this is what he says. God is without passions and is not affected with any affect of joy or sadness. Notice, God is beyond love and hate in the sense of God is beyond the passions of love and hate, which, of course, leaves open the door that there might be a way in which God is still capable of a kind of love. And that's what Spinoza is going to say later on. But, of course, you can see directly here why this would be. We don't need to go through the demonstration. God is not affected by anything. So God can't experience passions. God is impassive in that sense. Therefore, beyond the passions of love and hatred. Moreover, there's no exclusivity in the love of God. It's not a scarce good that includes some and excludes others. The chosen or the elect are loved by God, and those who are outside those groups are not. Rather, it's with Spinoza's God that the love of God is available to all equally. The love that individuals can have for God, first of all, which is what he's first considering here. Page 170, Proposition 20. This love toward God cannot be tainted by an affect of envy or jealousy. Instead, the more men we imagine to be joined to God by the same bond of love, the more it is encouraged. Demonstration. This love towards God is the highest good which we can want from the dictate of reason, and is common to all men. We desire that all should enjoy it, and so it cannot be stained by an affect of envy, nor by an affect of jealousy. And recall here, he refers to these propositions. Remember in part 4, he talks about how a rational man will want other people to be rational, because a rational man wants his own advantage. He recognizes the usefulness of other rational men. In fact, other rational men are the most useful thing that there is in the world for a rational man. And a rational man is going to seek this knowledge and therefore the love of God. And so, I want to share the love that I have for God with other people, because that's going to make me better off, right? So there's no exclusivity in the love of God. This isn't a matter of, I want God all to myself. That doesn't make any sense. The key advantage of focusing our mind on love of God for Spinoza over all other loves is that this love is the most constant. And it's the most constant because, unlike all the other objects that we might love, the love of God is not opposed by any contrary passion. And in fact, there's a certain sense in which it isn't really a passion, because this relates to my adequate ideas. It relates to, as it were, and this becomes clear a little bit later on, it's a kind of self-love, actually. My love of God is really just a love of something that I'm a part of. And so it's not so much a matter of narrowing my focus and seeing some external thing causing something to be done to me, but rather it's a matter of my activity. That'll become clear a little bit later. So the object of this love lacks the instability and variability of other objects. Page 171, look at the second full paragraph there. He says, sickness of the mind and misfortunes take their origin especially from too much love toward a thing which is liable to many variations and which we can never fully possess. For no one is disturbed or anxious concerning anything unless he loves it. Nor do wrong suspicions and enmities arise except from love for a thing which no one can really fully possess. From what we have said, we easily conceive what clear and distinct knowledge, especially that third kind of knowledge, more about the third kind of knowledge coming up in a bit. Whose foundation is the knowledge of God itself can accomplish against the affects. Insofar as the affects are passions, if clear and distinct knowledge does not absolutely remove them, at least it brings it about that they constitute the smallest part of the mind. And then it begets a love towards the thing immutable and eternal, which we really fully possess, and which therefore cannot be tainted by any of the vices which are in ordinary love, but can always be greater and greater and occupy the greatest part of the mind and affect it intensely. The love towards God can always grow because you can always expand your knowledge of God, and it's not like you're ever going to lose it. That's what he's saying. Now, of course, you might at this point say, wait a minute, what do you mean? What about hate? Isn't it possible to hate God? Don't people hate God? And to this, Spinoza would answer no, actually. And he argues for this as follows. This is back on 169, Proposition 19, right at the bottom there. Proposition 18, rather. He says, no one can hate God. Switch this here. No one can hate God. Demonstration. The idea of God which is in us is adequate and perfect. So insofar as we consider God, we act. Consequently, there can be no sadness accompanied by the idea of God. That is, no one can hate God. Because of the nature of God, contemplating God can only increase our adequate ideas, and therefore our activity, therefore our power, therefore our perfection. And increasing your understanding of God, therefore, is purely good for you. And for Spinoza, it's impossible to hate what's purely good for you. Okay, so this leads to the second discussion question. Do you agree with Spinoza's assertion that the intellectual love of God is the highest and most rational good that men can want? If so, what in his conception of the love of God and his argument for its supreme goodness did you find convincing? How would the average human being have to reorder their priorities in order to pursue this good? And if you do not agree with Spinoza, what are some of the other higher goods that you see, and what makes them higher than the love of God? So that's the second discussion question. Do you agree with Spinoza's assertion that the intellectual love of God is the highest, most rational good that men can want? If so, if you agree with him, what in his conception of the love of God and his argument for its supreme goodness did you find convincing? How would the average human being have to reorder their priorities in order to pursue this good? If you do not agree with Spinoza, then what are some of the higher goods that you see, and what makes them higher? By Proposition 20, Spinoza has completed his explanation of how knowledge alone can be a remedy for the affects and can lessen the sadness that results from deleterious external causes. He does this, first of all, by reducing their proportion of the mind, the proportion of the mind that's occupied by the passions, by confused and inadequate ideas. And he does that through replacing the passions with clear and distinct ideas. And second, he does this by replacing the unstable objects of love that come from external objects with God itself as an object of love. So you might think at this point that the task of the ethics has been completed. He's given us the model of the free man, the ideal exemplar of humanity. He's explained how we go about training the mind in order to realize this ideal. Of course, the work of doing that still has to be done, but he's given us at least the conceptual framework for doing it. So it might seem like the work should be completed now of the ethics, but it turns out this is not quite so just yet. Spinoza makes a surprising declaration at the end of the long scholium to Proposition 20. This is on page 171. He says this. This is the last paragraph. With this, I have completed everything which concerns this present life. Anyone attends to what I have said in this scholium, and at the same time to the definitions of the mind and its affects, and finally to Part 3, Proposition 1 and Proposition 3, will easily be able to see what I have said at the beginning of the scholium, namely that in these few words I have covered all the remedies for the affects. So he's covered all the remedies for the affects. So now it is time to pass to those things which pertain to the mind's duration without relation to the body. Now, what's surprising and puzzling about this, of course, is that previously we were told that the human mind just is the idea of the body. The human mind just is the idea of the body. And this would imply that there can be no duration of the mind without the body. For what would the mind be without an actually existing body for it to be the idea of? But yet Spinoza says, no, we will pass to those things which pertain to the mind's duration without relation to the body. So what's going on here? Has he changed his mind? Well, from this point on, Spinoza will be concerned to lay out a theory of two religious concepts that you might have thought would be out of place in a naturalistic metaphysical system like his. And these are the concepts of blessedness, and eternity. So blessedness and eternity. Okay, so we start with Proposition 21, which affirms that imagination and memory, or what he calls recollection, depend upon the actual existence of the body. So, reading between the lines here, you can see that whatever this duration of the mind without relation of the body is, it's not going to contain either imagination or memory. Proposition 21, the mind can neither imagine anything nor recollect past things except while the body endures. Demonstration. The mind neither expresses the actual existence of its body nor conceives the body's affections as actual except while the body endures. Consequently, it conceives no body as actually existing except while its body endures. Therefore, it can neither imagine anything nor recollect past things except while its body endures. So this proposition is basically built into the definitions of imagination and recollection itself, both of which concern the ways in which external bodies impinge upon the human body. So if there's no actually existing human body, it's impossible for anything to impinge upon the human body, and so memory and imagination are impossible as well. However, this should not be taken to imply that the human mind as such cannot exist without the body. Recall that the human mind at its most basic level is nothing but a set of ideas in the infinite mind of God, a little subset of ideas in the infinite mind of God. And this presupposes that there's something that remains of the human mind apart from an actually existing body. This is the point that Proposition 22 essentially makes. Nevertheless, in God, there is necessarily an idea that expresses the essence of this or that human body under a species of eternity. Demonstration. God is the cause not only of the existence of this or that human body, but also of its essence, which therefore must be conceived through the very essence of God by a certain eternal necessity, and this concept must be in God. Proposition 23 draws the inevitable conclusion from this and affirms the eternity of the mind. So here's what it says. Proposition 23. The human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the body, but something of it remains which is eternal. Demonstration. In God, there is necessarily a concept or idea which expresses the essence of the human body. An idea, therefore, which is necessarily something that pertains to the essence of the human mind. But we do not attribute to the human mind any duration that can be defined by time, except insofar as it expresses the actual existence of the body, which is explained by duration and can be defined by time. That is, we do not attribute duration to it except while the body endures. However, since what is conceived with a certain eternal necessity through God's essence itself is nevertheless something, this something that pertains to the essence of the mind will necessarily be eternal. Scholium, we have said this idea, which expresses the essence of the body under a species of eternity, is a certain mode of thinking, which pertains to the essence of the mind and which is necessarily eternal. And though it is impossible that we should recollect that we existed before the body, since there cannot be any traces of this in the body, and eternity can neither be defined by time nor have any relation to time, still we feel and know by experience that we are eternal. For the mind feels these things that it conceives in understanding no less than those that it has in memory. For the eyes of the mind by which it sees and observes things are the demonstrations themselves. Therefore, though we do not recollect that we existed before the body, we nevertheless feel that the mind insofar as it involves the essence of the body under a species of eternity, is eternal, and that this existence it has cannot be defined by time or explained through duration. Our mind, therefore, can be said to endure, and its existence can be defined by a certain time only insofar as it involves the actual existence of the body, and so to that extent only does it have the power of determining the existence of things by time or of conceiving them with duration. Okay, so what's going on here? Well, here's one stab at it. So the argument seems to be something like this. Premise one, in God there is an idea of the essence of every human mind. Premise one, in God there is an idea in the essence of the essence of every human mind. In God there is an idea of the essence of every human mind. Premise two, the essence of the human mind is not defined by duration. The essence of the human mind is not defined by duration. Premise three, what exists as an idea in God is perceived through the essence of God. What exists as an idea in God is perceived through the essence of God. Premise four, what is perceived through the essence of God is not is not defined by duration, is eternal. Premise four, what is perceived through the essence of God and is not defined by duration is eternal. Premise five, hence the human mind is eternal. So here's the argument again. In God, there's an idea of the essence of every human mind. The essence of the human mind is not defined by duration. What exists as an idea in God is perceived through the essence of God. What is perceived through the essence of God and is not defined by duration is eternal. Hence, the human mind is eternal. Some observations about this argument. On the second premise, so the second premise was the essence of the human mind is not defined by duration. The idea is that, well, ideas can contain content that is indexed to a particular time. It does not itself have a temporal nature. So this is a very particular notion of ideas, in some ways closer to Plato than to the ephemeral mental states that are posited by John Locke, for example. So, for example, I can have the idea, actually Spinoza would say, I am in part the idea. Brent Collar has the property of being witness to a computer camera light at 4:01 p.m. on Tuesday, October 27th, 2020. Right, so that idea is indexed to a time. It contains a time in it, but it's a proposition that's true or false eternally, that always was, is, and will be true. Of course, we might use tensed language to refer to it, but the point is that the ideas have a kind of tenseless essence to them. And they're true of a human body insofar as the body is enduring, but they also have this kind of essence that isn't defined by duration. That's what he wants to say. So the mind that, as it were, survives the end of the duration of the body is a kind of set of these propositions. And if that would be the case, then the eternity of the mind is clearly not a personal immortality. For one thing, Spinoza emphasizes in the Scholium that the mind conceived in this way doesn't have a power of recollection, except when it is connected to an actually existing body. So it's difficult to attribute personal identity to any entity that can't recollect itself. The eternal mind, as Spinoza conceives of it, seems to be little more than a subset of ideal propositions, which seems like a far cry from traditional notions of personal immortality. However, as we'll see, Spinoza will go on to do more with this sparse notion of the eternal mind. It will come to represent, most of all, a kind of way in which we can experience our mind as having an eternal aspect in the here and now. Experiencing our mind as eternal in the here and now. That's what seems to matter for Spinoza. And thereby we can experience a kind of present joy and escape from the fear of death. That's something that occurs in the present. It's not something that is going to occur in a future afterlife for Spinoza. And this will be for Spinoza a brand of human perfection, virtue, and blessedness. Propositions 25 to 28 lay the groundwork for connecting the notion of blessedness with the third kind of knowledge, You'll recall that this third kind of knowledge was laid out in part 2, and this was called intuition by Spinoza. And looking back to page 57, just to remind you, he said, about this third kind of knowledge, or in the center of the page there. He says, in addition to these two kinds of knowledge, namely, of course, the first kind of knowledge and the second kind of knowledge, we won't go back into those, there is, as I shall show, another third kind, which we shall call intuitive knowledge. And this kind of knowing proceeds from an adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to the adequate knowledge of the formal essence of things. So the third kind of knowledge is intuitive knowledge. It's a kind of knowing that proceeds from an adequate idea of the formal essence of certain attributes of God to the adequate knowledge of the formal essence of things. Proceeds from God to things. So I mentioned before that this is very obscure, what exactly he has in mind here. Intuition appears to be, well, one more thing we can say, that remember there was this example he gave, this mathematical example on 57. He says, suppose there are three numbers and the problem is to find a fourth, which is to the third as the second is to the first. Three numbers, the problem is to find a fourth number, which stands to the third as the second to the first. Merchants do not hesitate to multiply the second by the third and divide the product by the first, because they have not yet forgotten what they heard from their teacher without any demonstration, or because they have found this in the simplest numbers, namely from the force of demonstration in Euclid, from the common property of proportionals. But in the simplest numbers, none of this is necessary. Given the numbers 1, 2, 3, no one fails to see that the fourth proportional number is 6. And we see this much more clearly because we infer the fourth number from the ratio, which in one glance we see the first number to have to the second. So intuition here seems to be a kind of immediate intellectual vision or intuition, intellectual insight. You just see that, 6 is the answer to this problem, right? That's the upshot of the example, it seems. So and that carries with a kind of self-evidence or certainty as well as being clear and distinct. You clearly and distinctly see this. It's indubitable, absolutely certain. So to summarize what Spinoza says in part 5 about this knowledge of the third kind, or intuition, here's what he says. He says, this represents the greatest striving of the mind, since it proceeds from an adequate idea of God to an adequate idea of the essence of things. The more we understand things in this way, the more we understand God. Thus, the greatest excellence, i.e. virtue, of the mind comes from intuition. Self-evidently, the more the mind understands things in this way, the more it wants to understand things in this way, because it's determined by its nature to strive for this. The greatest satisfaction there can be arises from this third kind of knowledge because it leads the mind to its greatest possible perfection. Propositions 29 and 30 reintroduce and explore the notion of knowledge under a species of eternity, and really introduce the notion of knowledge under a species of eternity, and relate the mind and the body to this type of knowledge. To summarize what he says in these propositions, 29 and 30, the mind is capable of understanding the present existence of the body in two different ways. On the one hand, I can conceive of it as presently existing and enduring in time, as a presently existing, enduring object in time. That's one way I can conceive of the body. The mind can conceive of the body as a presently existing, enduring object in time. On the other hand, second way, I can conceive it according to its eternal essence in a way that is outside time, so to speak. That is, I can conceive of a body without its temporally determined predicates. For example, what Spinoza seems to have in mind here is, I can understand my body according to the eternal characteristics of extension that it embodies, without referencing the particular or specific time in which it instantiates those eternal characteristics, which follow just from the eternal essence of God. So that would be conceiving of my body in an eternal aspect. To conceive things under a species of eternity is to conceive them in and through the essence of God, through God's essence, as they exist in the mind of God, so to speak. Okay? So that's the point. The contrast to the conception of things as temporally existing, enduring objects. We conceive of them under the species of eternity. This second way of viewing them. Proposition 31 makes the point that the third kind of knowledge is knowledge that depends upon the mind's eternity. So he says, 174, Proposition 31, the third kind of knowledge depends upon the mind as on a formal cause insofar as the mind itself is eternal. Demonstration. The mind conceives nothing under a species of eternity except insofar as it conceives its body's essence under a species of eternity. That is, except insofar as it is eternal. So, insofar as it is eternal, it has knowledge of God, knowledge which is necessarily adequate, and therefore the mind, insofar as it is eternal, is capable of knowing all those things which can follow from this given knowledge of God. That is, of knowing things by the third kind of knowledge. Therefore, the mind, insofar as it is eternal, is the adequate or formal cause of the third kind of knowledge. Scholium. Therefore, the more each of us is able to achieve in this kind of knowledge, the more he is conscious of himself and of God. That is, the more perfect and blessed he is. This will be even clearer from what follows. But here it should be noted that although we are already certain that the mind is eternal, insofar as it conceives things under a species of eternity, nevertheless, for an easier explanation and better understanding of these things that we wish to show, we shall consider it as if it were now beginning to be, and we're now beginning to understand things under a species of eternity as we have done up to this point. We may do this without danger of error, provided we are careful to draw our conclusions only from evident premises. Proposition 32 links this third kind of knowledge to knowledge of God. He says, whatever we understand by the third kind of knowledge, we take pleasure in, and our pleasure is accompanied by the idea of God as a cause. Demonstration. From this kind of knowledge there arises the greatest satisfaction of the mind there can be. That is joy. This joy is accompanied by the idea of oneself, and consequently, it is also accompanied by the idea of God as its cause. Corollary, from this third kind of knowledge there necessarily arises an intellectual love of God. For from this kind of knowledge there arises joy, accompanied by the idea of God as its cause, that is, love of God, not insofar as we imagine him as present, but insofar as we understand God to be eternal. And this is what I call intellectual love of God. So the mind can conceive of its body's essence under the species of eternity, that is, as it exists eternally in the mind of God. This constitutes an eternal knowledge of the mind itself as well, a kind of eternal self-knowledge, or the mind's knowledge of itself under the species of eternity. And this knowledge is itself an adequate idea of the body. As an adequate idea, it consists of knowledge of God, part of God. And the mind, insofar as it knows the body in this way, can also know everything that follows from this knowledge in an adequate way, as an adequate type of knowing. And this is the third type, or intuitive knowledge. And the more a man achieves this type of knowledge of himself, the more he knows God and the more blessed he is. So that's what Spinoza says. Now, what on earth does this mean? Right? This is something that commentators have struggled with and thrown their hands up about this. What is Spinoza getting at here? And this is the puzzle commentators. Basically, it seems like there's sort of two options here. One is that you can understand Spinoza thinking here as a type of scientific knowledge, a kind of scientific self-knowledge. You know, the more you come to have a kind of absolute, it has to be an absolute scientific perspective on yourself. So, you know, a scientific perspective on yourself from the perspective of the true, ultimate scientific theory, you come to have knowledge of God. That would be one option. The other that's been proposed is this is some kind of mystical knowledge of essences of some sort that Spinoza is getting at. And it's hard to say definitively. But at any rate, I mean, one thing is clear is that seeing yourself, both mind and body, in their interrelations with each other as part of God from the species of eternity, not as a historically existing being to be described autobiographically, that for Spinoza is the ultimate form of knowledge, knowledge of the third kind, intuitive knowledge, and the supreme form of joy, love, blessedness, and virtue are bound up with achieving that kind of knowledge. The more that we see ourselves as part of God or nature, and the less as an individual atomic entity, the more perfect and blessed we are. So this notion of the intellectual love of God is further expanded in Propositions 33 through 37, which encapsulates and expands upon some of the notions we saw earlier. But I'll just skip over those. There's a connection between the eternity of the mind and the intellectual love of God. So in a conventional religious view, the belief that the soul is immortal and that there's an afterlife leads to the consoling thought that death is not the end, and thereby can assuage the fear of death. Now, we've seen that the eternity of the mind in Spinoza is not a personal immortality. Instead, what it is a way of experiencing ourselves in this life. That is, in experiencing your body and therefore your mind under the species of eternity, as we just described, you are really, in a certain sense, experiencing the eternity of the mind, but in this life. That's what he was referring to, I think, here when he says that we're conceiving itself, this is at the end of 31, conceiving itself under a species of eternity, and we shall consider it now as if it were beginning to be. And we're now beginning to understand things under species of eternity. Because the point is that we are, as it were, arriving at this knowledge of eternity within the temporal order as we proceed in expanding our understanding and seeing ourselves under the species of eternity. We sort of enter into the eternity of the mind in a certain way. But of course, the normal consolation of immortality then is not going to be available to the Spinozistic free man. It's not going to be some, unending afterlife. But there is a parallel form of peace of mind that is available. Because for Spinoza, the more we relate our mind to God, the less we will fear death. And this is what he describes in Proposition 38. The more the mind understands things by the second and third kind of knowledge, the less it is acted on by affects which are evil, and the less it fears death. So the greater, as it were, our mind merges into the eternal mind that it is within the mind of God when all of its ideas are adequate, the less we fear death. So there is something, just like the promise of an unending afterlife for the conventional religious believer provides a kind of consolation from the fear of death, because you think, well, death isn't really the end, so therefore you're consoled. For Spinoza, we don't have that kind of consolation because he doesn't believe in this kind of unending afterlife. But we still can remove the fear of death, which we do by identifying ourselves, as we might say, with the eternal mind that exists in the mind of God. So this leads to a third discussion question, which is, how does Spinoza's view of the eternity of the mind relate to the conventional religious view of the immortality of the soul? Is Spinoza's view able to replace the traditional consolations of religious notions of the afterlife? In particular, can the eternity of the soul in Spinoza's sense release the human being from the fear of death? Why or why not? Well, for Spinoza, essentially, this kind of knowledge is blessedness, and it is virtue. In fact, virtue isn't something that is a means to an end, but rather it is this state of blessedness, which is an end in itself, in which we identify, or might say we increase to the maximal extent the proportion of our mind which is adequate ideas, and that amounts to a kind of identification between our enduring mind, the mind that endures in time in relation to our body, with our mind as it exists in the mind of God, which of course is in God the same thing, but of course isn't experienced that way by us in our temporal life. And if that sounds like it's not such an easy thing to do, Spinoza would agree with you. In this rather stirring conclusion to the Ethics, he says this, the bottom of page 180. He says, with this, I have finished all the things I wish to show concerning the mind's power over its affects and its freedom. From what has been shown, it is clear how much the wise man is capable of, how much more powerful he is than one who is ignorant and driven only by lust. But not only is the ignorant man troubled in many ways by external causes and unable ever to possess true peace of mind, but he also lives as if he knew neither himself nor God nor things, and as soon as he ceases to be acted upon, he ceases to be. On the other hand, the wise man, insofar as he is considered as such, is hardly troubled in spirit, but being, by a certain eternal necessity, conscious of himself and of God and of things, he never ceases to be, but always possesses true peace of mind. If the way I have shown to lead to these things now seems very hard, still it can be found. And of course, what is found so rarely must be hard. For if salvation were at hand and could be found without great effort, how could nearly everyone neglect it? But all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare.